Hi there, I'm Lois McCullen Parr, and it's my privilege to be part of this project. I'm going to turn off Cozy Sheridan, who's singing about being perfect and how being perfect is all by itself. I am honored to be asked to share something as part of this Lenten group for the Anti-Racist Devotional. It's my first time doing it, and I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and I'm part of the United Methodist Queer Clergy Caucus. I came to anti-oppression work through LGBTQ justice within the United Methodist Church. That's where I started, and that led me to anti-racism work and to the discovery that I'm white, which I guess I would say has significance in pretty profound ways as a white person in this world trying to attend to all the lies I've been told. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit today by hearing from Jesus. So my text is Mark 8, verses 27 through 38. I'm going to read first from the New Revised Standard Version. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Simon Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of God with the holy angels." All right. There's always a blessing in the receiving. Yeah, the receiving of God's holy word. I'm trying to figure out how to receive it. I'm going to be 60 this year, and I have spent a lot of time in therapy, a lot of time to find myself. So I have some pushback when I hear Jesus tell me to lose my life to save it. And then I also remember that we are in Lent, and this is a season that, after all, begins with dust, and a season that invites us to repent, invites us to contemplation, to self-examination, and I would say an invitation to practice what we hear about from ancient times, metanoia, to make a change. And I'm thinking about that when I hear these words from Jesus today. I do love the Gospel of Mark. It's my favorite gospel. And without the birth story, jumping right into ministry, it probably goes with me and a kind of type A personality, and it uses immediately however many times, and Jesus is always on the way somewhere, and I can relate to that, right? I'm a go, go, go kind of person. So they're on their way when Simon Peter is the type A student. When Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" right away, "Oh, pick me, Messiah," right? I got it, right? And, I've been the know-it-all in class. I've been Simon Peter, so I know what it's like to say, pick me. I got the right answer. And I'm glad that I have people in my life who call me up like Jesus calls up Simon Peter, who call me in, who say, it's not what you think. All right. So cool. You know it all, Jets. I mean, I think in the context of the story, in the context of where they are, this is not the Messiah that Peter has in mind, right? He wants to be on the winning team, and he has an idea about what Messiah is supposed to mean for these people who live in an oppressed land, right? He wants it to be fight fire with fire, I guess it would say. And I think sometimes this gets this text gets used in places. Get behind me, Satan, is some pretty powerful language. I don't think Jesus is calling Simon Peter the devil. I don't think that's how Jesus is talking about it in the Greek language here. But talking about Simon Peter being an adversary. In other words, you're like, I got a plan. God's got a plan through me, and you're in the way. So, like, get behind me because you're in the way. So I think it's that's worth paying attention to, right? The plan, which Simon Peter is not really all that excited about, is the one that Jesus describes as a plan of suffering. And I think if we invite people, like, come on over to my place. We're going to suffer. Like, people don't want to do that. It's not popular. The theology of the cross, I think, has been abused in Christian tradition to mean endure your own suffering because God's going to use that in some way or somehow, or like suffering produces endurance, enduring blah, 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 right? But it seems to me like that's a way for theology to beat people up, to take the suffering that they're personally experiencing and imagine that it's used for some higher purpose that they can't possibly understand, right? But I do not think that's what Jesus is talking about in what we got going on here. When he's talking about what in Christian tradition we might talk about the theology of the cross, which I think in some ways is, theologians talk about the theology of the cross as claiming the difference between the church and Christian, or between faith and certainty, or the difference between hope and optimism, right? It's not about winning, but it is about, it's not about saying that the cross is the winning way per se. It is about saying the cross shows us that God is one who suffers in solidarity and compassion. And of course, for Simon Peter and this gang that are hanging around with Jesus, there's a real cost to thinking about the cross, and it's a dangerous time. And so those who are on the way in this group of followers, time and again, Jesus is telling these folks stuff they don't get, they don't understand, right? And so Jesus says something, they scratch their heads, they ask him to explain it, and so on. And so I think the same thing is happening here, because Jesus is trying to explain that God's plan is not to fight the empire with the same kind of power, but to turn the power on its head and use a different kind of power. Of course, we're always going to read it as Christians. We're Easter people, so we always read the story backwards. We always know the rest of the story of the resurrection. And so we always know the theology of the cross is not the end of the story. There's going to be a resurrection. There's going to be death overcome, and so on. So we hear this knowing that there has to be a crucifixion in order for there to be a resurrection. But I wonder when and here's where I brush up against my therapy, what do I hear in take up my cross or lose my life? And I think one of the things that Jesus is trying to teach the disciples over and over again is that it's not about your own suffering being used for some higher purpose you don't understand, but it is about understanding who's suffering and the suffering of others. Kind of the question for all world religions about why bad things happen to good people. Certainly Simon Peter and this group of those followers don't want to be in pain. And in fact, I would argue that they think following Jesus is going to eliminate their pain, right? So they want pain and doubt to disappear. Peter, in a way, says what everybody else is thinking, but Jesus names something about the pain that they're actually already carrying because the empire's power is abusive and because they live in an oppression where they are, right? And so this idea that the meaning of life is not to eliminate the pain, but to find our identity in following Jesus, knowing that nobody is exempt from pain, right? And I don't know, I mean, I think that pain could be a lot of things. It could be self-produced pain. It could be pain coming from something else. It could be pain because of your own identity and the crap that is set up in all the systems of oppression that lead to the pain of people who suffer under systems of oppression. But also, I think it could be the pain of what it means to be an anti-racist who wants to stand up for what you believe in, who insists on the justice, love of God, who may actually find that there's a cost to taking in a stand. But I think thinking about, in this Lenten time, about what it means to change or to transform, what it means to think about what gets in our way. If Jesus is saying to Simon Peter, "Get behind me, you're my adversary, you're in the way of God's purpose here," I have to look at my own life and what gets in the way for me to try to follow what I am hearing as God's purpose. And it could be my own arrogance, my own know-it-all condition. It could be my own rage, my bitterness. It could be my own greed. It could be my own privilege. It could be my own prejudice. But how do I get rid of those things and find the grace that is offered to me, find the call to live like Jesus, to follow Jesus in a way that leads to the resurrection? Yeah. So I do think it has something to do with looking pain in the eye and looking fear in the eye. And I, as I said earlier, I think nobody's exempt from brokenness and pain. That's been my experience and my experience as a pastor. And I can't say what it is for you, but I can tell you a little bit about my own, and I can tell you some things that I think are connected to whiteness that are true for me. I think I learned pretty early in my life to wear a mask and to cover up feeling and to deny things. And I guess another way to say that is I learned pretty early on how to lie. So I learned in my home, especially a household where we lived with mental illness. My dad lived with depression and manic depressive bipolar disorder. My other members of my family, that is part of my family history. My own experience of living with depression has informed everything I do. But as a kid, I learned about that, like a lot of people do, that there's a stigma with mental illness. I learned that on a sort of micro level in my home, that tears and feelings and grief and really not being okay was like, well, it was dangerous. It was not going to be okay to not be okay. And so I learned to lie, right? And I mean, I think there's a way in which we are taught that in our culture, just in the simple thing of how often we greet one another with, "Hi, how you doing?" And nobody really wants the answer to that question. How you doing is really hi. It's just longer. Because if you've ever answered how you doing with an honest answer, but people really are not interested in hearing it. They don't want to hang around and talk to you. Try that. I do that, and people run away from me. But let me go on back to what I was saying. I learned as a girl that we don't show our brokenness, right? We don't show our brokenness to others. And I think a little bit of it is that stigma of mental illness. So I'm a white family, right? What happens when we show our wounds? What will the neighbors think? I'll get hurt if I'm vulnerable. Or I might be overcome by loss and grief that are very real, painful, sad things. And so I was taught that we're in favor of strength and self-sufficiency, or at least the appearance of these things. So if you're not really strong, if you're not really self-sufficient, you are going to wear the mask, you're going to lie, and you're going to pretend that you have those things. And I'm convinced, while for me personally, this is really tied to mental illness in my family, I'm convinced that this is actually whiteness. Like, to favor strength and self-sufficiency and perfection, actually, is dominant white supremacy culture. And so I think it gains traction and continues to be sustained because it's this agreed upon lie. It's the way we lie about United States history. It's the way we lie about the genocide of Native peoples who were here before anybody came from Europe. It's the way we lie about what it meant to enslave people to build the economy of the country. It's the way we lie about what freedom means in the United States of America. It's the way we lie about what the national anthem means. It's all that. It's the continual lying about who we are as a people. And I think that in one sense, it's that you could call it a lack of transparency, but it's white dominant culture, and it's dangerous. And I don't think it's faithful for Christians. And so I think this text can invite us to a different kind of living. It can invite us to be with people who are hurting, to listen for where the hurt is. And so I'll tell you how I answer that question. When people say to me, "Hi, how you doing?" I say, "Hi, I'm white. I have a home. I have insurance. I'm a United States citizen. I'm a woman and I'm married to a man, and I'm safe. And I love a whole lot of people who are afraid. I love a lot of people who fear for their kids every day when they go to school. I love a lot of people who are afraid that somebody in their family is going to be deported. I love a lot of people who are suffering. And so I'm not okay because I care about them." And so how do that's, you see why people run from me and don't want to have a conversation with me. But the question, I think, for me to ask myself as a Christian, and this is what I'm asking myself in this Lenten season when I'm called to think about making a change, is how do I ground myself in being a white person who is always looking for ways to disrupt the dominant white culture and the internalized dominance. The biggest challenge for me is that internalized piece and what it means for me to be honest with myself. And so here's where I think I have to hear Jesus too, to say, what does it mean for me to pay attention to the suffering of the world as a place where God is in solidarity with the world? And to know that the promise that comes through what we would call a theology of the cross is that, as the author, who may or may not be Paul, writes in Romans, that nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God. So if nothing can separate us from the love of God, how do we hold on to that as we seek to relieve the suffering of other people, to be part of relieving that suffering, and to do that by disrupting internalized dominance and disrupting systems of dominance. I think this is where, when Jesus is trying to make the disciples understand that I'm not going to operate the way the empire operates, that we could hear a word too about operating in a way that the empire of white supremacy operates. And and that we're probably not going to be able to disrupt everything by doing it the same way the empire already does it. We can't disrupt white supremacy with white supremacy. So how do we do things differently? How do we operate in our lives in such a way that we disrupt these lies we've been told and the patterns that we have of operating out of those lies? For me, it's about trusting that God is with me in the suffering, and trusting that it's okay to talk about my suffering and talk about the suffering of others that concerns me deeply, and that makes me suffer too, because it hurts and my heart hurts, and that to be honest about that is actually a path toward healing and finding hope. Because if I'm not honest about it, then I don't know what the heck I'm doing. What kind of justice, love am I fighting for if I'm not honest about where it needs to show up, right? So I'll just say one other thing about what it was for me to grow up in the church. I've always been in the church my whole life, and I didn't have any kind of dramatic conversion story, but it was really a therapy where I believed that I was beloved and that I didn't earn grace, and that there was nothing that I could or couldn't do that would make God love me more than God already loved me. And I think what I'm learning every day in my journey to disrupt internalized white dominance is that that self-love also has to be a part of this journey of disrupting internalized white dominance and disrupting white supremacy in the world, because living authentically and coming out as queer and coming out as a white person who seeks to disrupt racism, and coming out as a person who seeks to disrupt sexism, coming out as somebody who seeks to tell the truth about the systems that have bound us up, is what I'm supposed to do. And so how do I continue to discover and learn that it can make a difference how I live? That I'm going to see things through the eyes of Jesus, which means seeing what he sees, which means seeing who's weeping and seeing where the pain and suffering is, and helping to transform my own pain so that I can be part of something different that can really transform the world. I just want to end with a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh writes a book called Together We Are One, and he writes about the significance of what it is to be a part of something greater than yourself, and what it is to connect with other people who are part of something greater than yourself. And he writes about the significance of one person. So I think there is this both and of Lent. We start with dust and we talk about our mortality. We say we're going to return to dust, and we are. We're here for a short time. So happy birthday me. This year I'm 60. What have I done so far? What am I going to do as long as I'm still here? This is what Thich Nhat Hanh says. History is already different, or I might say herstory is already different because you are here. The world has changed because you showed up. So if that's true, just showing up actually makes the world different. I want to ask myself when I hear this text from Mark and Jesus saying you must lose your life to save it, how is my showing up? How is my showing up really making a difference in the world? So that's my word for today, and I hope you are blessed, and I hope that you are certain to, when you think about God, that you are certain in knowing that God loves you no matter what, and God has plans for you. So I hope you'll join us, those of us who are part of an anti-racism movement in the world. Peace be upon you. Bye.